with unity in the chair. The motion before the House was this House would ban all depictions of the Prophet Muhammad, with Michael Dunn and Ashish Kumar taking the win. Michael believes this to be his third greatest achievement in life, behind reaching the finals of Worlds and winning the birth lottery.
Before we begin, could we get the speaking order and gender pronoun preference from opening government.
Daniel Healbay.
Saskia, no preference.
Opening opposition.
Owen, you please.
And then Kiana, I prefer she.
Closing government.
Us and Tom in that order. He for both, please.
And closing opposition.
Darian first, no preference then. Bailey, second, no preference, thank you.
Without further ado, I'd like to call the Prime Minister.
This
I'd
has
like to call the Prime Minister the open motion that stands in their names, which is this House welcomes the end of American interventions.
For too long, the American belief they have access to a universal and universalizing ideology that improves the lives of all the people in the world has led to crass and outrageous interventions that massively raised conflicts in our society, massively increased the likelihood that people will turn against those values in and of themselves. We stand for the decline in US intervention. What do we mean by this? We mean that any time the US tries to push beyond its own boundaries to control, influence and sway the decisions of other governments, this means military interventions, this means drone strikes, but it also comes down to things like using the aid to manipulate countries into enforcing policies in the US interest. It means using the UN to lobby for US values of democracy and those kind of things, because we don't think these values are universal. We don't believe they're universally applicable, and we stand against them. They have created a reactive situation where they adopt an excessively bullish approach that harms way too many people and does not deliver any of the benefits the United States claims they will. 2 points. Firstly, why this is fundamentally illegitimate. Secondly, why this makes the world a much worse place. So why is this illegitimate? Firstly, there is no clear reason that America possesses any absolute claim to know what the good is and the way people should live their lives. Every experience of how you should run your government is entirely subjective. But this isn't even just things like, is democracy good or bad? America asserts a very clear view of how democracy should occur. It should occur within a free market capitalist state, and they define the exact kind of democracy you should have access are inherently good, or the ways they adopt it are inherently good. I think that this process requires eliminating alternative conceptions of the good to enforce your very individualist conception of capitalism. The fact that an individual is an island and a republic in and of themselves, that the US often adopt. You have to annihilate any alternative ideology which pitches things like having a greater community or collective idea. You have to remove those for this to stand, because it can be the one and only doctrine which you need total buy-in. So the US has to remove this. So it's always an either this or that scenario, and the US enforcing it illegitimately. Secondly, the US has disproportionate coercive power within the system because of the overwhelming military capacity they have, because they're economic dominant. It means they have overwhelming responsibilities and power they can exert, and we think they use those too far to enforce a clear and direct approach of how you should live your lives. We think that steps beyond what they should have. With great power comes great responsibility in this instance. Moreover, it contradicts their own values. When they talk about rights to self-determination and tell you how you should self-determine, that is contradictory. When you try and set up systems for how you should decide, your whole thing is you should decide yourselves, you're always going to corrupt your own system. This has been the US approach since the end of World War I. Second point on legitimacy. They're going to potentially talk about the other groups that have power in these kind of things, and they impose excessively oppressive regimes. Firstly, recognise that the US system is not of freedom. It is one of oppression. It tells you you should be subject to the capitalist inequality where free markets will dominate your life and determine your outcomes. But also, to get to that stage, they often ally with groups like warlords because they provide stability, which we need long-term to develop these better outcomes. They bargain with the devil and get them to produce these outcomes, and they do side for oppression in so many instances. Secondly, often these local groups are potentially claiming to have belief of local actors, so we don't say that's why that's right. We also think the oppression of alternative sources of power gets worse. Finally, on legitimacy, we think the US public is massively uninformed. They firstly don't have access to the lived experiences of most of the world, and the US media doesn't cover it, so they're never able to make informed democratic choice. But also the government is able to scaremonger. They will talk about like national security and use that for droning people in other countries, and the US citizens never actually make any informed democratic decision of that. But finally, when they do act and actually make democratic choices, almost always reactive and out of guilt, where it's like, oh, someone is dying elsewhere, we should send troops in. They never realise or evaluate the actual consequences of their actions. So we think they are the worst actors to make that decision, yes.
If a country is strong and stable and being successful, how is the US going to manipulate their country and use intervention to corrupt them in the way you speak of?
So we think that loads of countries aren't solid and stable, and they're usually that way because of the US intervention that has made them unstable. So that's the reason. So, why this makes the world a worse place? Firstly, it exacerbates conflicts. Couple of reasons. Firstly, the US's intervention often creates an incredible amount of collateral damage because they will adopt things like drone strikes. Because the US's system is about minimising casualties to their own people, with the body bag effect will stop any of their interventions lasting. If you put American troops in harm's way, they will pull out as soon as possible because the American public will backlash against it. This means you adopt things like drones, but also like aerial bombing to minimise your own casualties. This means loads of locals and innocents suffer. Not only is that an atrocious thing in and of itself, because they will die and their innocence, that's bad, but also it radicalises people because they see the inhuman treatment of the US and want to fight against this. This means reactively the conflict grows greater. Secondly, the US can rarely intervene purely by itself, so it has to subsidise local actors. So it pumps guns into regions, giving actors incredible amounts of weaponry and that kind of thing. And just flooding guns into a region does not build long-term stability, it just exacerbates conflict. Secondly, the security dilemma this creates, that's within certain countries where there is disproportionate power. With regards to countries like China, who have potentially similar powers to the United States, it makes the actions of these actors far worse. Why is this? Because China feels there is a threat from the US, because the US is a very bullish actor on the international scene, that they will potentially intervene against Chinese interests in the Southeast Asian Sea, that they will propagate against their claims on islands within the Southeast Asian Sea. This forces you to be as aggressive as possible because you want to create amongst all your allies a fear that if you side with the US and potentially side with their intervention, you will clamp down as hard as possible. This promotes far greater aggression and tension because when people are afraid of the US's actions, they will have to militarise and become as aggressively defensive as possible to respond against that. So it makes the situation far more aggressive. We don't think they will become perfect actors, but they're actually incentivised to be much worse actors when the US is adopting an approach of far more intervention. Thirdly, the US will often be coercing groups for economic interest because of the power that big US firms have over government. When you have this economic coercion, people massively react against it because you substantially disadvantage and drive people into poverty so US firms can benefit. This will be states because they feel this fear of them. For all these reasons, I am proud to propose.
Honourable panel, the Prime Minister lives in a world that doesn't seem to acknowledge the fact that the US is not the only large actor that seeks to influence those around it. We say the threat of American intervention is in fact an important building block of the structure of the world and the way that geopolitical politics is played out that ensures we have balance in how the world works. Because the reality is that it's not that without American intervention, it's not there would be no intervention by any actor. We think there are other actors such as Russia or China who would seek out the desire to influence others. What we would tell you is that there is not a perfect world. You don't have to stand over every single American intervention that's gone badly. But we do think the threat of those interventions and at times the continued intervention of the United States is necessary. Three pieces of substantially we'll bring you. Firstly, let's talk about a multipolar world. Secondly, let's talk about the specific structure in certain regions of the world and how it's propped up by the possibility of American intervention. And thirdly, let's talk to you about why other regimes will always tend towards influencing the others around them and intervening as such. So some rebuttals. Okay, no thank you. What we would say is that it is imperfect to have the possibility of American intervention for many nations. But we would point to you that many nations, in fact, unlike what Ram has told us, desire the possibility of American intervention in their regions because their very existence depends on that possibility. If you point to nations such as Taiwan or Israel, without any possibility of American intervention in their regions or the world is one that ensures that their very existence cannot continue to happen. They in fact depend on those interventions. What we would tell you is that for that reason, that is necessary. We also say that in relation to, as regards to, say, guns pumped into the region, again we say you don't have to stand over every specific intervention and how those specific interventions may have gone badly, but we think the principle still stands. So let's talk about a multipolar world. So we think essentially, no thank you, the way the world has been structured is ultimately that smaller states have always had the need to ally themselves with larger states, and as time has gone on, those states have actually gotten larger and larger. So you may have had 700 years ago several large powers, and now we're moving towards a world where there are actually quite a limited number of very powerful actors within regions. The United States, Russia, China exert a massive sphere of influence covering large portions of the world, and they compete to ensure that the world falls under their influence. At the point at which one of those actors, indeed the most powerful actor, the United States of America, chooses instead to move away from the possibility of intervention, the threat that can no longer happen, what that allows is an imbalance to occur whereby those other powerful actors, such as Russia, such as China, are unencumbered and unlimited in their ability and desire to move into other areas and to exert influence over others. We can point to specific examples such as the East China Sea, or like the massing of Russian troops along the Estonian border or the Ukrainian border, or in fact Russian troops now in Ukraine, as instances where the world, the lines that are drawn on many of our maps literally depend for many individuals on the possibility of an American intervention or American continuing an outward and progressive stance in relation to that. So yes, you may tell us that some nations don't always consent into that particular intervention, but actually many nations do desire and require that intervention and see it as a good and positive thing, and that clashes directly with what you said. No. So let's talk about the specific structure of certain regions and use them as case studies to examine this point. So, for instance, the threat of American force, specifically in relation to Southeast Asia, which is a current battleground that is playing out, is an important one. Years, the diplomatic model that built up in that region, they hub and spoke one, whereby many Southeast Asian states were unable to ally themselves for historical reasons. They didn't trust each other, and what they instead used, they served as spokes on a wheel, and in the middle sat the United States of America. And the threat of force and the intervention of the United States is what ensures that balance remains in that region, because many of those states now face a growing and powerful China that is growing faster and faster, unsurprisingly, and like many nations throughout history, is now converting that desire from economic growth to instead dominate a region politically, militarily, and other ways. The threat of military force firstly is threatening itself because it threatens many of those states in their existence. China has shown itself willing in the past to invade states such as Vietnam. But beyond that, even not necessarily invading, but the very threat of military force allows and ensures that political deals and economic trade deals that occur between those nations are imbalanced ones. Because it's very hard to deal with China on a level footing if you're Vietnam and fear the possibility of them militarily intervening or deciding suddenly actually another piece of sea belongs to them. Or in fact a certain region is probably actually Chinese. That is the kind of imbalanced relationship we have. Without American intervention, the possibility in the end of it in history, what you see then is a China emboldened and willing to move into those regions as they've shown themselves to be. We point specifically to the arguments of the Spratly Islands, the Sanakaku Islands, as examples of essentially rocks that have very little value in and of themselves, but are instances where China is desiring to broaden its sphere, to take land that is claimed by others, claim sea lanes which are specifically important for economic reasons, to see that specific example of that broadening interest. Again, no thank you, we can point also very briefly to Russia, what they've done in Ukraine, and again the massing of troops in specific borders, as again threats of them moving into those areas. Without the threat of US threat of force and intervention, those nations would have to fold to the overwhelming and greater power of China or Russia. Tom.
One of the reasons we see increased tensions in East Asia is precisely because US military presence allows governments like Park's in South Korea and Abe's in Japan to flame the forces of militarism. Why wouldn't you support removing this if it makes the chance of a total all-out war in the region less likely?
Okay, because it's very easy to point to the militarization of Japan and suggest that as a bad thing. It may not be a good thing, but it is in a reaction to the massively broadening desire of China to move into areas, to claim new regions, to claim sea for itself, invest in incredible amounts of money into weapons, specifically displaying different weapons it has developed, such as the new release of their new missiles that can take down, or they claim can take down a US air carrier. That militarism is in direct reaction to the burgeoning militarism of China. So we reject that as a fair characterization of what's happening. But why do these regimes like China or Russia, why will they always tend towards that? Well, the very structure that their political systems operate is an autocratic one, whereby essentially the contract that exists between government and the governed is as follows. You can't have particularly good rights, you can't have specific desires that you might have, but what we give you in return is incredibly good growth. You've seen that up to recently in China and up to recently in Russia. At the point at which we can no longer provide growth, as those regimes can't, what they do is the following two things. They often move into other regions and seize land, so that's a very easy way to grow your economy. You just seize a load of like resources, that's a short way of growing yourself. Or secondly, you build a narrative of a greater Russia, a greater China, a burgeoning power that ought to take its place among the world, and be the most powerful nation, representative of the incredible intellect and brilliance of their people. Those are the exact narratives that we see playing out in Russia. We think that those nations will move, as all large nations have historically, whether it's Britain, France, Germany, and move to occupy an important position in the world that directly clashes with the desires of those around them. We urge you to oppose.
Either of these two? Deputy Prime Minister is for opening government.
Sorry, there's not a lot of room for paper. This is useless. I'm just going to hope this works. The opposition side can name a couple of examples and say, here, it might be problematic. We argue that in a lot of those examples, first of all, the US interventionism that has historically existed and continues to exist today is largely at the root of a lot of these problems. On top of that, we will argue that it exacerbates the bad behaviours that they have named amongst large international actors like Russia and China. And finally, we will argue that the kind of backlash this causes creates a self-perpetuating cycle, demanding more and more interventionism economically and militarily around the world by the US in a way that continues to exacerbate conflict. Right. Why do we think the US is an especially bad actor here? We think it tends to be more interventionist than Russia and China. It adopts its values. It's an idea of value supremacy, whereas Russia and China build their nationalism more around geographical and ethnic makeup and the kind of right to a certain language and things like that, whereas the US is much more founded around the idea that they have the supreme understanding of freedom and liberalism and democracy in a way that other people can't understand. You see that in the way they debate things and the way their political rhetoric works, arguing that they are, that they are the one true free nation in the world, unlike the rest of them. And as a result, they feel genuinely legitimized and imposing that on the rest of the world. On top of that, they think that their economic model is so supreme that they have a right to impose it on the rest of the world in order to extract their resources and things like that. So they are easily able to legitimize that and much more ideologically geared towards interventionism than either of those states that I mentioned. On top of that, we think that the way their corporate incentives work mean that they are inherently extractive and much more willing to make problematic trade decisions and build their foreign policy around that. Why? Because we think that the way that the US, the US does not have much of a democratic check on these kind of interventions, A, because their public are fairly uninformed about these things and the way that people communicate other experiences from around the world, on top of which they have an intense ideological attachment to the kind of capitalism that they engage in that is highly extractive from other countries, which means that they're very unwilling to prevent this kind of thing through democratic checks and balances. That means that corporations that sponsor the massively large, high-cost elections that go on in the United States mean that they have incredibly large sway over the way foreign policy works. Because the US's elections are just way higher cost than any other country. Foreign policy of a huge superpower based on on the fact that they are able to bankroll them. That means that US corporations have a huge say. We think that neither their democracy, the US public, nor democracy nor corporations have a legitimate claim to governing other parts of the world. But on top of that, we think it's particularly problematic in the way they go about it. Right. So what kind of things do we think this looks like? We think that so far this has largely involved a lot of actions like literally intervening in bombing places, boots on the ground, trying to rebuild governments or take them down. That has also involved propping up dictators financially and militarily around the world, in southern and central America, in the MENA region, in south and central Asia. We think that when the vast majority of the globe has at some point felt some impact, thanks to the fact that the US government is willing to intervene and literally bomb parts of their people or prop up people who are attacking their people, literally murdering one another, we think that is massively problematic. On top of that, things like enforcing trade agreements that, engaging in trade agreements that force liberalization onto countries that do not need it at that point because it is incredibly useful to them. In Africa and South Asia, they systematically undermine economies in those worlds at the expense of their own sovereignty, their own people's needs, and their own people's preferences. This is global and systemic. Why does it continue to get worse, though? We think this kind of self-perpetuating thing is, first of all, culturally inherent in the kind of actions that they engage in. First of all, because of the experience of war and intervention that they create for those people. Sorry, I'm just going to take my jumper off. It gets warm when you speak. When you have a situation in which you have been bombed repeatedly, or you have seen yourself bombed and you associate the or attacked, or certain human rights abuses perpetrated against yourself, your neighbours and members of your family, and you associate that with a particular foreign government, one with which you have no ideological connection, but even if you did, that ideological connection is very quickly severed at the point where they've blown your country up. So at that point, you have not only the feeling that and the resentment that is perfectly legitimate of your people having been attacked, but also your culture being attacked. Because at the point where they're blowing you up, they're also saying, we're morally better than you. And we are going to now institute new ways of running your country, because we are better at doing it than you after we've destroyed you. So they do this by taking apart institutions and rebuilding the people to sustain those institutions, and as a result you've ended up with systematic, routine state collapse and failed states, as well as just really incompetent governments and weak states in situations like Iran and Iraq, where they have taken apart governments and either allowed, causing a cultural backlash that leads to incredibly dangerous governments and very violent governments and repressive governments, they're able to justify themselves based on violently anti-Western politics. They legitimize their violence towards their own people and people abroad by the fact that their own people have felt under threat from that violence. At the point where you've felt under threat from violence, you are far more likely to be willing to live under a regime that is violent towards you and others because you think it is better than the only alternative. When the only alternative is the US, you will submit to a hell of a lot. Closing.
Which is worse, US value supremacy or Putin's aggressive territorial expansionism?
Okay, so when you talk about, so we heard from Ukraine from opening up as well. The problem with this is that the Ukraine conflict was not inevitable, okay? It came about because they feel threatened by the westernization of countries like Ukraine that are incredibly close to them. Ukraine was applying to join the EU at the point where they're interested in engaging with institutions that are not only Western, because Putin isn't so anti-Western that he can't bear to see other countries near him act in a certain way. He feels threatened, first of all, because of NATO's close proximity to his own borders, encouraged and funded a lot of the time by the US, but particularly the fact that the US dictates the political narrative and the political priorities of institutions like NATO. And because there is a huge overlap, as a result, also institutions like the EU and other institutions that he negotiates with in East Asia. That means they feel encircled, they feel reactionary. The US's agreement in the region of the South China Sea is part of what makes China feel threatened and act in a much more violent manner. At the point where they, both China and Russia, are ideologically less prone to being expansionist and interventionist. You see this in the way they engage in economic activity in China, in Africa, for example. They don't put conditions on their aid because they have no interest in ideological control of these places. They just want to trade and make a mutually beneficial solution for most people. Yes, they still have some forms of extractiveness, and yes, they have some forms of countries, and overruling their sovereignty and their ability to dictate the way they run their own country. The US and the Western values are more able to compete with these problematic nations at the point where they are less willing to instruct the rest of the world how to run their governments while stealing their resources and overruling their people. We beg you to propose.
First final speech. Feel good about it?
Definitely opposition continue interposing opposition.
I'd like to say that I tried to lead the rest of the speakers in a coup to add the words "in Ireland" to the motion. They refused, so here we are. So what I'm going to talk about instead are the creation of international legal norms, why we think that is a net benefit to the globe, and why that has had the US at the centre and would have always required to have the US at the centre of it. And I'm going to talk about stability. First, rebuttal, and then a bit of framing. Rebuttal. Number one, the idea that the US based their supremacy on the understanding of their values as paramount or supreme to anyone else's, and that is worse than China and Russia, who base their understanding of their supremacy on geographical claims or cultural claims or ethnic claims. Like, notice that that is entirely unsubstantiated, but it's also entirely counterintuitive. Notice that if you want to make an intervention in another country based on your values, you also generally have another reason to do it, i.e. they have mineral deposits that you want, or they have oil. And the reason that you are saying that you are going in there is to spread democracy. Whereas if you are Russia or China and you genuinely believe that you have a geographical claim or a cultural or ethnic claim to a piece of land, that is the only reason that you need to walk across that boundary and claim that land. That is what we have seen borne out empirically. That's why the US doesn't parachute itself into random countries in the back end of nowhere that also are not free market capitalist states with very weak democracy. It only does so when it is otherwise in its interest. So it's a total fantasy to say that the US is worse than other actors because it bases it on some nebulous concept of what it believes is right or what its belief of understanding of absolute truth is. I think it's actually far worse when those things are based on geographical claims towards history, which we think are the alternative actors in this comparative debate. Number two, the second idea we get, no thank you, is that from Saskia's speech, is that many countries have loads and loads of historical issues because of US intervention, and many countries apparently don't have issues because of the intervention of other countries. Ultimately, if it is the case that the US has intervened more, that is literally a byproduct of industrialization and simply having the power quicker to do that than other nations would otherwise have had to. It is not an indication of going forward what it is that we will see at the point at which the US is continually able to intervene, but so are other actors. Number three, the idea that there is little democratic checks on US interventions, therefore bad. Again, non-comparative. Notice that without spending 7 minutes of my speech on it, it is genuinely the case that there probably are more democratic checks on when the US intervenes, legitimately at least, insofar as you do need to get it through the Senate. Whereas I genuinely am unsure what checks there are at all in Russia. I know that nominally they have to get it through their higher house, but even so, they have managed to lay claim to large areas of land militarily without doing any of that. Number four, the idea that Russia and China don't put conditions on their aid. That's just a lie. Russia and China consistently put massive conditions on their aid, frequently to the same extent that the US do. Often the worst case scenario that you can't see them in the ICC, or best case scenario that you side with them in whatever conflict dispute is currently cool and upcoming in Africa. Let's talk about a bit of framing. The idea that we get from Prop up to now is effectively the case that without the US intervening in various different countries at their whim, we would otherwise have a peaceable group of nations who would otherwise not want to expand their spheres of influence. We think even those cursory description of what it is that a state's incentives are would prove that to be untrue. Number one, to provide goods for your citizens. Often you can't do that within your own state and therefore would have a reason to breach the territoriality or the territorial integrity of other states to take their goods. Or number two, to expand the influence either for the sake of those leaders to feel themselves more powerful, or for example to make land grabs because that itself widens the sphere of influence, or maybe you make land grabs because you believe you have historical legitimacy to that land. Notice that borders certainly are far from settled, and historically have been far from settled, meaning that many different countries lay claim to various different schemes of land. So that would continue to happen. Notice also that the idea that we get from Tom that the reason that Japan are weaponizing is because they feel threatened by the US, or the reason that China act threatened is because they are threatened by the US is nonsense. They've never provided any analysis, and I think it is entirely counterintuitive that China would not want to increase its territoriality in the way that we have seen it do, even if the US did not exist. Notice, secondly, we think a world in which Japan does not rely on effectively the US to prevent China from encroaching militarily in that area is one in which Japan militarizes a lot faster, and probably a lot more, insofar as they can't rely on the US military umbrella like many countries in this world do. They tell us that there is no absolute truth about the goodness of democracy. I would love to stand here and give you a 7-minute speech on the goodness or badness of democracy, but I don't think that's going to win this debate for either side of the House, because ultimately we think the threat of US intervention is something that will ultimately, whether democracy is good or bad, provide net good for the world. They claim that we're using specific examples, that we have to stand over the really bad examples of the US randomly intervening in various different countries. It's just implausible that the US intervenes when it would like to, for no particular reason. Generally, there are underlying reasons, even if it is the case that it claims that it is to uphold democratic values. That means that the US does not wander around randomly intervening in various countries. It does so for strategic reasons, which means that you can plan in advance what the US is going to do, and that is some degree of check on it, even if that's your only issue. But notice that increasingly, US population are becoming incredibly war-weary and incredibly less likely and less willing to, to allow their leaders to randomly wander into various different countries. So we think that is also ongoing, more of a wash. Tom?
Considering partisanship in the US political process is at its highest level since the 1890s, do you think the US has an effective political machine in order to be able to deliberate whether to fight wars and how they should be fought?
I don't think that matters, insofar as regardless of whether the US is the one fighting wars, there will be wars fought. We would rather that the actor fighting them was the US rather than Russia or China. Let's talk briefly about international legal norms then. We think that ultimately one of the greatest achievements of the 19th and 20th centuries is the creation of legal norms to which we hold all countries. Notice that international law is not like domestic law. You can't impose it on countries. If they don't want to opt in, then there is no mechanism by which you can force them to do that. Ultimately, what the entirety of international law relies on is the powerhouse that is the US in order to keep it together. Either because we are afraid of the military might and don't want to transgress against them, or because we want to keep them on side insofar as they will provide preferential trade deals for them. Without a powerhouse like the US, the system of international legal norms ultimately falls apart because there is no incentive to follow them, because there is no benefit necessarily to you for following them. We also think that the existence of NATO is entirely predicated on whether the US is or is not involved. Notice that NATO can't do anything without the US Army or Air Force to carry them from country to country. That means that all the peacekeeping missions that the NATO is currently involved in Afghanistan, in Somalia, melt away, and you are left with far more and increasing hostility in those areas without the powerhouse that is the US to ensure that those wars don't happen. Ultimately, states have a reason to go to war. We like this one state because it generally does good things. We like the threats that it can give. We are happy to this side.
This debate has so far revolved around the current status quo and the immediate short-term harms or benefits of intervention and otherwise. What we are uniquely going to bring to you from Closing Government is a description of American polarization in domestic politics and how that disables America from doing any form of post-conflict reconstruction, which will necessitate a cycle of constant interventions and constant interventions, right? And at the end, I will briefly do a rebuttal about China and Russia and why we win on that comparative. onto American domestic politics. Look, currently we are facing the highest level of political polarization since the 1890s, right? Qualitative studies show that there is an increased distrust between Republican and Democratic Party voters. Not just that, but there are an increasing rise of factional groups such as the Tea Party and Donald Trump within Republicans, and you have Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Webb who are explicitly populist and socialist in their ideology within the Democrats, right? You have increasing polarization of not just the politicians themselves, but of the voter base itself, right? This means that it is increasingly unlikely that there will ever be any bilateral support for any intervention, whether currently or in the future. Why is this bad? This is bad because if a particular government wants to undertake an intervention or continue it, a president has the capacity to use executive order to sum up the current funds and soldiers. But in the long term, Congress is in a position to block any form of funding going through for a constant intervention and post-conflict reconstruction, which is most important. Why does this happen? This will happen because every election issue will become about the war, because it is easy to caricature, especially these days, your opposition politicians as evil, cartoonish, right? It is easy to make a political issue that we need to stop the body bags coming back, we need to stop the war from happening, which means it is likely that the war will become a political issue. The moment the government changes, and the government changes based on war and foreign policy, right, you will have a withdrawal and a retreat of this particular intervention, which will lead to large-scale systematic problems within these policies. Note, currently, while there was like large bilateral support in the case of Iraq, there is literally no bilateral support when it comes to, for example, Syria, i.e. Congress is consistently blocking Obama's attempts to intervene further, like an environment of no cooperation. Why is this harmful? Look, we are going to take both opposition teams on their highest. We are going to assume from closing government that they beat the enemy, whoever the enemy is, completely. We're still going to tell you why this is a terrible idea. Firstly, on the concept of enemy, you literally cannot know who the enemy in these particular regions is. So, for example, note the Al-Nusra Front in Syria and Iraq, right? They are people who are, while they're an Al-Qaeda affiliate and therefore seen as an enemy of the US, they're at the same time funded or supported largely by the locals because they consistently fight against Bashar al-Assad, right? Whereas it is in these regions, the borders are so muddled and muddled to the extent that there is no clear line between good and bad parties. It is impossible to know which particular groups you want to fight against and you want to target. In that instance, you inevitably end up targeting certain locals who will have different interests to the ones you may have, right? But why is that important? That is important because you not only gain vast amounts of deep-seated resentment against the United States of America. This prevents any form of post-conflict reconstruction. What do I mean by this term? I mean, once an enemy, whoever that is gone, assuming that you have the capacity to do that, right? You need to create political, democratic institutions for long-term stability. You need to create the framework for elections, domestic elections, and so like local elections, and then on the national level, right? How is this impossible? Firstly, by virtue of having engaged with locals to an extent that the locals now hate you, to the extent that you have been fighting Sunni militias that the locals have been supporting, they refuse to engage with whatever you set up. Like, i.e., even if they do somehow engage in political, right? What is the best example of this? Hamid Karzai, post-2001 intervention within Afghanistan. He literally had no control outside of Kabul within Afghanistan, right? Because the locals refused to engage with that particular government and saw it as a Western-installed puppet regime. Why? Like, you can also see this in the behavior of local individuals, such as the constant defection of the US-trained Afghan army, right? They constantly defect and end up going to the Taliban or local warlords, right? Because they feel that the current political institutions set up have been a Western-implemented system designed to combat themselves, right? But like, this is an ideal case where they are able to do this sort of reconstruction. What is going to happen is that they're not going to happen. I.e., look at Iraq and look at Afghanistan, right? It didn't happen. In Afghanistan, what does this mean? When they leave immediately after an intervention, as they did in the 80s with USSR, right? What happened, right? It created a particular political vacuum. It allowed local warlords to gain lots and lots of power in regional bases, right? That created a political vacuum in the center, which allowed the Taliban to gain strength, right? Similar analysis applies to ISIS in Iraq, right? When they immediately leave, there's no one to occupy the center because democratic institutions or economic policies have not been formed, and they come in, destroy everything everything and leave. Why is that problematic? Because it allows further radical groups, more radical than the previous ones, to come forth in the center, which requires a future intervention, right? This cycle of intervention has been seen from the 1980s onward, right? And the US has done nothing, right? Domestic politics in the US is important because that analysis shows why this reconstruction will never be carried out, and even if it is, it's not going to work because there is such deep-seated resentment. No, thank you, right? Why is this like absolutely terrible? Well, I mean, for fairly obvious reasons, but I'll take, okay.
The worst thing a US president can do is fight an unsuccessful war. You tell us successful wars depend on bipartisan funding. At that moment, it would suggest that that's exactly the reason why no US president at the moment would dare go to war for a risk of a failed war.
I mean, Obama is still trying to go to Syria for one, so that's not true. Secondly, we tell you a successful war does not depend on bipartisan voting. What I said is that is a reason for any reconstruction effort to fail. The point also is, even if it is undertaken, it is bound to fail because of the kind of hatred you create by engaging in muddled waters where there are no clear divides between the groups you want to engage with, right? In that instance, we tell you that you necessarily create the worst possible conditions for intervention. Why do we win on the comparative rebuttal to China and Russia? Look, firstly, we have proven to you concrete harms, proving both historically why this has happened and this is likely to continue in the future. They have potential harms. I would like to hear an example of a country that Russia and China are literally going to invade in order to compete the comparative on our side. Secondly, we tell you the TPP currently, the economic policy, is going to be succeeded by a project called the TPP track because China is forming a trade policy with Australia and New Zealand called the RCEP. The long-term interests are to combine both economic treaties so US and China have similar trade agreements, right? In long term, they have similar economic interests and they want to align with each other. That gives an incentive for China to not be conflictual. It also doesn't have a reason because it is aggressive because it is scared of the US. The US leaves, it has no reason to be scared at all, right? They can't just assert that they are more in conflict and less, that they are inclined towards conflict rather than cooperation. We tell you reconstruction is impossible. US has done so much harm to these countries. Proud to propose.
Deputy Leader of OP said that she didn't want to spend 7 minutes talking about why democracy was good. Members of the House, guess what? I think a lot of the harms in this debate were sort of generally contentious, right? It is plausible that US intervention has led to some conflicts getting worse in some cases. It is plausible that it's led to some conflicts getting better. I think the one thing we do know, as Gov handily concedes to us, is that the US has succeeded in some extent in spreading democracy, maybe a very particular form of democracy, but a democracy nonetheless. So I bring you 2 points of extension. First, I'm going to talk about democracy and why there might actually be a good case for it being good in some cases. Second, I'm going to talk about war and explore why, magic debate phrase, on the comparative, the US is a bit better than other actors at doing the war thing. First, democracy. The claim we get from OG is that America enforces a specific version of democracy. Yeah, if we can prove that democracy in general is a good thing, we are happy to accept that a specific free market version of democracy is still comparatively better than the alternative. So, OJ says American intervention contradicts the right to self-determination. Here's the problem. In non-democracies, people don't have the right to self-determination. It is not a thing that exists for people who live under the yoke of oppressive regimes or regimes that are semi-autocratic. I submit that democracy is the framework by which self-determination is enabled. It gives control of government policies and decision-making to voting populations. Now, here's the crucial thing. If people decide later that they don't like democracy, brilliant, you can vote in a regime that's more autocratic. The point is, democracy itself is a system that is option maximizing because it gives a voting population the ability to decide what system of governance it itself is going to be exposed to. Why is this important and plausibly the most important thing in this room? So, the first thing I observe is just a principle claim. I do not think that states are legitimate in visiting violence upon their citizens without the legitimate consent of that citizen body and interference that body has in the agenda of the state. States are quite violent to people. They have the ability to extract your property via taxation. They can put you in jail, put you behind bars for a variety of reasons. This sort of violence will never ever be condoned between two individuals, so thank you. What makes the state legitimate in doing so is the consent which individuals give to that state. And the consent is only meaningful if you have some say no thank you over which state that is. So in the first place, I submit there is a broad claim. If America has succeeded in spreading democracy, that's good because it enables the rights of individuals to select the state which they prefer. A couple of things flow from this. Firstly, I think in a world with American intervention, yeah, it's plausible that some of that democracy is going to be a particular form of free market democracy that's American. But at the very least, that's a stepping stone towards democratic systems that are more representative of the views of their people. The comparative is a world in which the people never have that option. But secondly, many of Gulf's problems flow from the lack of democracy itself. The fact that states are unable to engage as democratic institutions with the West, are unable to express legitimate preferences of their own people, is precisely what leads to problems like a lack of communication between the West and these states. I'll take you in a moment openly. So for these reasons, I submit that in principle, we enable individuals to gain the right to self-determination. Openly.
What consent do people in these other countries around the world give to the US to bomb them or to fund people to repress them?
Yeah, right, so that's a different issue. That's war, which is coincidentally what I'm going to get to in a minute. But more generally speaking, I don't think on the comparative, individuals in places where the US bombs consent to the brutality of the regimes that the bombs are targeting. I think that the US, given that unfortunately consents are washed in those cases, at the very least those regimes are broken down and they are able to protect themselves. One small thing, no thank you. They claim that democracy is threatened because there is resentment against the West. I think this is at best a wash. Given that many people resent the West for not intervening in some cases, at best I think the reaction to democracy is mixed. By and large, people are quite happy with the right to self-determine for themselves what their futures will look like. That's a win for our side. Let's talk about war. So, OG claims, and to some extent, closing Gulf, claims the US behaves irresponsibly, which is extended in the second where they talk about value supremacy. Opening up says other countries are worse. So, as opening up correctly identifies, the question is not like example tennis, right? How many times has the US done bad things versus Russia and China? We need structural analysis about why the US tends to behave, or will tend to behave more responsibly in the future. So I give you a couple of reasons. I submit that US foreign policy is more open to critique and more open to change. Critique. So the US foreign policy, by and large, thank you, is observed by international, it's something which is influenced to some extent by international observers and by its own voting population. This is conceded by Closing Gulf when they talk about, in their extension, how war becomes a political issue that people care about. That's the point. People care about these issues. It's likely that we become involved in the process by which these decisions are made. But secondly, and crucially, we think that the US foreign policy is more open to change because the US, unlike the other actors Opening Up talks about, is actually a democracy. That means voting populations have some influence over how that foreign policy is shaped, unlike citizens living within Russia and China, whose governments more or less act with impunity. So on the comparative, US foreign policy is more likely to respond to public change. But why is public pressure likely to push foreign policy in a good direction? This was Closing Gulf's extension. They say that, but problems like the body bag effect, right, no thank you, and the fact that the public often reacts with some sort of visceral reaction to these sorts of conflicts. So, a couple of observations. Firstly, people are not monsters. I submit that there are some cases when individuals actually respond to some sort of moral incentive they have, right? When they see another country which is the victim of a gruesome bombing of their own, committed by their own soldiers, they are likely to respond to that sort of thing, no thank you, in ways that say, stop doing that, because that's immoral, no thank you. But also, these sentiments are massively influenced by the media. They're massively influenced by the sort of public debate that tends to encircle around these sorts of interventionist campaigns. So it is true that there will be massive public scrutiny, as CG claims in the extension, on these sorts of conflicts, and that's why it's more likely that these conflicts will be democratically processed in ways that won't happen on the comparative. But also, I observe that we do get better at interventions over time. Yeah, I know that interventions in the past haven't gone excellently, but there is some extent to which countries learn from their past mistakes and can shape their foreign policy and shape interventions in ways that are better. We saw NATO forces do a tremendously good job in the Côte d'Ivoire, for example, in the Second Ivorian Civil War, by learning from mistakes from past interventions that they have committed. That was an inside joke. So we do get better at interventions. But again, the point is a comparative. I submit that the US is more likely to become better at interventions precisely because of the openness to scrutiny that its foreign policy has. And this outweighs the comparative of other actors that Opening Gulf conceded, the Gulf conceded were going to be involved. As opening up was pointed out, those actors are likely to cause even greater militarization in regions where they exist. I point out also a basic chronological error. Chinese expansionism in East Asia began before the US pivot to East Asia. So given that other actors are likely to be aggressive and expansionist, we need the US to be some sort of bulwark against their presence, and they are likely to do so. The American dream got off to a shaky start, but it is far better than the nightmare of a world without its interventions. Happy to
I'd like to thank the member of opposition for the speech and close out the case for closing government, the government whip.
Closing opposition make two fundamental mistakes. First, they assume that the US will be successful in imposing democracy at the end of a bayonet. And secondly, they assume that the US wants to impose democracy and that is their primary interest within those regions. So given the history of the US and not only propping up regimes today like Saudi Arabia, but also propping up military junta throughout South America when it suited them, or propping up regimes like Zia Huq's in Pakistan in the 1980s in order to meet their immediate short-term objectives in defeating the USSR in a proxy war, we think it means it's likely that US interests are going to be based upon what is short-term good for the United States rather than what is good for the forces of democracy. 2 points in this speech. First, how do other powers react and what happens to democratization? Secondly, how do we gain the benefits of reconstruction? Hint, it's not by dropping £6,000 of freedom upon these countries. To the first point, how are other powers going to react? So we said that the mere presence of the US in the region in terms of having tens of thousands of soldiers across Japan and huge military bases within South Korea is what allows nationalistic forces within those countries to be stoked. So note that we need to get used to the fact that the US is never going to be the global hegemon that it was in the post-war era, and that we need to get used to the fact that there needs to be some accommodation of China as a rising power in the 21st century. Given this fact, that we haven't adapted to this world because the regimes like Park's within South Korea and Abe's within Japan know that they're able to build up their military forces, knowing that the US will always be there to support them. What did we hear from closing on this? They told us, but no, like this building of militarism in China happened like before the pivot, right? But the US had a continual presence within that region since the Second World War, a presence which has been continual and where they've had a huge implicit guarantee that they would defend those countries. In Japan, a very explicit guarantee. So what did opening opposition said? So we asked this to them in a POI and they said, oh, but they didn't really provide that much analysis for this. Like, Cleaner, welcome to the world of how POIs work. You didn't give us analysis out. No, thank you. You maybe have your own POI later. Good luck getting some nice analysis out of that one. Let's now look at what happens with respect to Russia's expansionist ability. So we've been painted a ridiculous story where Russia is just going to be able to storm into whichever Central and Eastern European countries that it likes. Note that the US is not the only country in NATO, so even if it withdraws, the countries like Poland would still have the implicit backing of the UK, France and Turkey to be able to defend them and provide implicit support. They might also have military, missile shields as are being built up within that region at the moment. But what we remove is one of the main forces of antagonism that makes a proxy war far more likely, that means that Russia is far more likely to move into that region in order to take advantage of what it sees as temporary US political effects, where they're unwilling to get involved to a true level because of the way Obama's foreign policy operates. What do we see happening long term within Asia? So the TPP is going to be signed in a few days' time on the 4th of February. What's going to happen after then is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is currently under negotiation between China, India, the ASEAN 13, Vietnam, New Zealand and Australia. So once this agreement is in place, the long-term trajectory is that there will be an alignment of the TPP and the RCEP. What that means is that the US and China will be brought within a common trading bloc under a common understanding of free trade within the next 20 years or so. We believe this means that the interests of China are ultimately going to be tied to the US in the long term, and it's unlikely there's going to be an all-out war within that region, particularly when China is going to be in the same trading bloc as Vietnam and dependent on many of these countries in order to be able to gain an income. We believe that there are going to be some territorial concessions to China. There's going to be renegotiation that will probably be in China's benefit over places like the Spratlys, but frankly we don't care about a few like rocks in the middle of the ocean or a couple of oil claims. If we can reduce the chance there's going to be huge military antagonism within East Asia. Oh, that wasn't a PI, that's the camera guy. That is more likely to promote the sort of catastrophe that will be more likely to destroy the entire region as a whole. What do we hear then from closing opposition on democracy? So they say, like, if we're going to have democracy, we might as well have free market, or we might have free markets as well, just as part of the package. I mean, I quite like free markets, but it's quite difficult to be able to create the incentives for free trade and democratic and liberal controls at the end of a gun. So what happens in actuality? So where you have popular movements for free markets, like with the Solidarity Union in Poland in the 1980s, that's when you get the popular support that allows economic readjustment packages like the Perestroika. Instead, when you force economic adjustment on countries in a way that their own political systems aren't set up to cope with, that's where you get the reduction of popular support for those reforms and mean you don't get stable government in the long term. I'll take opening.
You tell us that we have to accept receding US power in these regions. Why are democracies like South Korea and Japan instead choosing to stick with the US and not acquiescing? Might it be because they're getting a better deal?
So yeah, but like this debate isn't about like what the interests of South Korea and Japan are, which are presumably for their particular allies to be involved. We're looking at this on a global stage and taking a global framework, and we believe that the interest of South Korea may not necessarily be those of the world as a whole, particularly given the failure of US intervention in so many other places of the world. A few points on reconstruction. So even though this was the base of our extension, I'm getting to it quite late because we've had so little response and engagement to it from the closing opposition team. So we see that in the US we have such a cycle of partisanship and problems with the political process that negotiation is unlikely to occur in a good manner. Closing opposition tell us it's out of order, that it's all about scrutiny. But the problem is, the process of scrutiny isn't just about what happens in terms of deciding whether certain interventions are fine as they're occurring, but rather being able to invest the long-term political support in order to build the institutions of a nation. The fact that you're not going to get that popular political support when you're able to when you have a constantly changing and partisan Congress, which is likely to withdraw funding. Know that many Republicans, particularly those within the Freedom Caucus, tried to withhold funding for the military campaign in Syria. Given this reality, it's far less likely we're going to be able to have any long-term nation building and the types of democratization and direct control that they would need in order to be able to impose an entire free market and liberalization package from on top. That's why they don't get benefits, and particularly when the US has had such a lack of trust for the puppet system, and that's where you get people turning to the very groups we see promoting instability within the region. We believe that the wounds of US intervention run deep, and we want to now start the healing process.
Two things in this speech. Firstly, legitimacy in the world, which openly sort of brought and then kind of dropped. Secondly, how it plays out in the real world. My issue here, and the issue with the entire government bench, is the end feels kind of final. It feels like when you say we're going to end US intervention, that you're actually going to end US intervention, which means thousands of people who are relying on US intervention in order to ensure their livelihoods, in order to ensure their safety, fails, and all of a sudden, the people who oppressed them, the people who have been kept at bay by America, are now allowed to flood in. Their issue was, in a few select examples, it's been particularly problematic. My contention is, fine, drop those ones, don't end it entirely. I currently have cousins living on the Golani Heights who will literally die when Jordan invades because US manipulated Jordan through trade contracts, through trading negotiations that if they don't trade with Israel, if they invade Israel, they will cut off all American supplies. This is what means Jordan does not invade Israel. I shit you not, they've done it in the past and they would do it again. My contention is, you end this, my cousin literally dies. I quite like my cousin, not the best cousin ever, but first point. Legitimacy in the world. They say self-determination is needed and the US violates this. Note that in order for self-determination to exist, you need an alternative. Self-determination doesn't exist if I live under an autocratic regime and there is no alternative. What America uniquely does, they go, ever since Kennedy gave his inauguration speech, any person in any country that supports democracy, we will support unequivocally. This means they have a certain duty to these people to always support them going forwards. It means they get the self-determination opening once because they're able to choose between autocratic or American intervention. American intervention might not be perfect, but at least they got the choice in the first place. The second thing they said is they can't know what the greater good is. No, but America can always offer it to these people. They can always go, do you want this? Under their side of the house, you end this, and you mean these people in the most oppressed societies in the world never get the option. Notice that some countries have seen that they've been under an autocratic regime and chosen to get external intervention, but not gone to America. See Oman, who went to Britain in order for help, because they didn't want to go to America because they know their interventionist policies, but they did want to help, and therefore they went to the United Kingdom. It is possible to get help within these places and not to go to America. Second major clash point, how it plays out, how does it play out in the real world? I POI'd Bram and went, how do they go into strong and stable countries? And he went, US intervention caused the instability. Come on, Bram. Well, seriously, the instability had to be caused somewhere, and the instability was caused before the US went in. There's a genesis issue here, because the US went in because of the instability, because people in these countries demanded it of America, and went, we will die, there's a civil war going on in our country, please can you help us? These other people deserve their help. Maybe in select examples they're problematic, but in the vast majority of circumstances, at least in certain circumstances, we believe they should be allowed to go in. Our issue is they want to end it entirely. The second thing they come up against is US companies manipulate foreign policy and nationalistic further disputes the entire thing. Four things to this. Firstly, note that at least the American government is open to critique. This is different to the autocratic regimes that they are currently trying to leave. Note that the Israeli regime isn't likely to go, oh, you want to critique me? This is great. No, he puts a gun to your head, sentences your family to prison, and never lets any dissenting voices exist. At least in America, you get the discourse, you get the critique. And note that, no, thank you. At least it brings the discourse to what the best possible policy is. Under their side of the house, you never get any discourse to what the best thing for Syria is, because there's no longer a mass conflict or a mass intervention within these countries, and therefore you never get to input your idea to what the best policy is for these countries. Therefore, necessarily, there's a contraction of the amount of voices within these circumstances, and therefore you get the worst situation for these people. Simply says that they wind up having the US has previously propped up, no, thank you. They previously propped up shit countries and propped shit regimes. Notice that the issue here is that at least they allow the US populace to critique them. Notice that America is currently leaving places like Iraq because they are open to critique, and despite your companies that are currently quote-unquote manipulating everything, they are now leaving because they're open to critique and are open to the fact that maybe it wasn't the best thing and that continuing it would be damaging. Under their side of the house, you never get this critique, and Iraq is allowed to continue under this constant cycle of oppression, constant cycle of violence under the autocrats that you find problematic. The closing government continue in two ways. Firstly, it says a constant cycle of intervention. The first point it says was that you can never know who the enemies are. This seems like a poor point, right? I mean, presumably I can know who my enemy is because firstly, he has different principles to me and doesn't support democracy. But secondly, who asked you to go there in the first place? Thirdly, the guys shooting you are probably your enemies. And fourthly, the people who are currently oppressing people are probably your enemies, and you probably want to shoot them back. Bram.
So, what's your favourite recent democratic or reconstruction project adopted by the US? Libya
Germany was reconstructed by largely American investment. South Korea was largely American intervention and funding. They then said anti-Western narrative causes these conflicts. Again, there's a genesis issue here to presumably this conflict existed before Western influences came into these areas. Note that they normally go into these places because of the conflict. Even America can't sell going into a country before there's any conflict, right? Even America can't go, let's go into, I know, South Africa, which is a generally swell country, but we feel like it. There does need to be a conflict for them to solve. There is normally an issue that they are going in there to solve. No, under their side of the house, the evil dictators are allowed to continue with their narrative. You never get the American narrative, and therefore the long-run oppression continues literally indefinitely. Then they say post-conflict militias won't cause issues, that the US doesn't engage with the post-conflict things. Note that US current policy is clear, hold, build. The last bit being build, i.e. you stay there. Their issue for closing was that US leaves prematurely. I put to you that if America ends all intervention, that you're always going to leave prematurely in every single country they're currently in. And outside the house, I put to you, we should stay there in circumstances where it would be damaging to leave there prematurely. Right? The solution is quite simple. We don't leave. Why do we win? Because we show you why democracy has inherent value, which Darwin uniquely brings to you. Why it does actually mean that these people get some choice in what happens. Why even when it comes to war, why America has the unique experience of waging these wars, which means they are more likely to win, more likely to receive the outcomes they want, more likely to end the oppression sooner, faster, quicker, and least with marginally less bloodshed. For all these reasons, thank you.
I'd like to thank the opposition whip for their speech, and indeed thank all the speakers for what was an excellent final. We have a final round of applause.